Chapter 15 of The Ball and the Cross. This recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 15. The Dream of Mckeon. The system of espionage in the asylum was so effective and complete that in practice the patients could often enjoy a sense of almost complete solitude. They could stray up so near to the wall in an apparently unwatched garden as to find it easy to jump over it. They would only have found the error of their calculations if they had tried to jump. Under this insulting liberty, in this artificial loneliness, Evan Mckeon was in the habit of creeping out into the garden after dark, especially upon moonlit nights. The moon, indeed, was for him always a positive magnet in a manner somewhat hard to explain to those of a robuster attitude. Evidently, Apollo is to the full as poetical as Diana, but it is not a question of poetry in the matured and intellectual sense of the word. It is a question of a certain solid and childish fancy. The sun is in the strict and literal sense invisible, that is to say, that by our bodily eyes it cannot properly be seen. But the moon is a much simpler thing, a naked and nursery sort of thing. It hangs in the sky quite solid and quite silver and quite useless. It is one huge celestial snowball. It was at least some such infantile facts and fancies which led Evan again and again during his dehumanized imprisonment to go out as if to shoot the moon. He was out in the garden on one such luminous and ghostly night, when the steady moonshine toned down all the colors of the garden until almost the strongest tints to be seen were the strong soft blue of the sky and the large lemon moon. He was walking with his face turned up to it in that rather half-witted fashion which might have excused the error of his keepers. And as he gazed, he became aware of something little and lustrous flying close to the lustrous orb, like a bright chip knocked off the moon. At first he thought it was a mere sparkle or refraction in his own eyesight. He blinked and cleared his eyes. Then he thought it was a falling star, only it did not fall. It jerked awkwardly up and down, in a way unknown among meteors and strangely reminiscent of the works of man. The next moment the thing drove right across the moon, and from being silver upon blue, suddenly became black upon silver. Then, although it passed the field of light in a flash, its outline was unmistakable though eccentric. It was a flying ship. The vessel took one long and sweeping curve across the sky, and came nearer and nearer to Mckeon, like a steam engine coming round a bend. It was of pure white steel, and in the moon it gleamed like the armor of Sir Galahad. The simile of such virginity is not appropriate. For, as it grew larger and larger, and lower, Evan saw that the only figure in it was robed in white from head to foot, and crowned with snow-white hair, on which the moonshine lay like a benediction. The figure stood so still that he could easily have supposed it to be a statue. Indeed, he thought it was until it spoke. "Evan," said the voice, and it spoke with the simple authority of some forgotten father revisiting his children. "You have remained here long enough, and your sword is wanted elsewhere." "Wanted for what?" asked the young man, accepting the monstrous event with a queer and clumsy naturalness. "What is my sword wanted for?" "For all that you hold dear," said the man standing in the moonlight, "for the thrones of authority, and for all ancient loyalty to law." Evan looked up at the lunar orb again as if in irrational appeal, a mooncalf bleating to his mother the moon. But the face of Luna seemed as witless as his own. There is no help in nature against the supernatural. And he looked again at the tall marble figure that might have been made out of solid moonlight. Then he said in a loud voice, "Who are you?" and the next moment was seized by a sort of choking terror lest his question should be answered. But the unknown preserved an impenetrable silence for a long space, and then only answered, "I must not say who I am until the end of the world, but I may say what I am. I am the law." And he lifted his head so that the moon smote full upon his beautiful and ancient face. The face was the face of a Greek god grown old, but not grown either weak or ugly. There was nothing to break its regularity except a rather long chin with a cleft in it, and this rather added distinction than lessened beauty. His strong, well-opened eyes were very brilliant, but quite colorless, like steel. MacIan was one of those to whom a reverence and self-submission in ritual came quite easy, and are ordinary things. It was not artificial in him to bend slightly to this solemn apparition, or to lower his voice when he said, "Do you bring me some message?" "I do bring you a message," answered the man of moon and marble. "The king has returned." Evan did not ask for nor require any explanation. "I suppose you can take me to the war," he said, and the silent silver figure only bowed its head again. MacIan clambered into the silver boat, and it rose upward to the stars. To say that it rose to the stars is no mere metaphor, for the sky had cleared to that occasional and astonishing transparency in which one can see plainly both stars and moon. As the white-robed figure went upward in his white chariot, he said quite quietly to Evan, "There is an answer to all the folly talked about equality. Some stars are big and some small. Some stand still and some circle around them as they stand. They can be orderly, but they cannot be equal." "They are all very beautiful," said Evan, as if in doubt. "They are all beautiful," answered the other, "because each is in his place and owns his superior. And now England will be beautiful after the same fashion. The earth will be as beautiful as the heavens, because our kings have come back to us." "The Stuart—" began Evan, earnestly. "Yes," answered the old man, "that which has returned is Stuart, and yet older than Stuart. It is Capet and Plantagenet and Pendragon. It is all that good old time of which Proverbs tell, that golden reign of Saturn against which gods and men were rebels. It is all that was ever lost by insolence, and overwhelmed in rebellion. It is your own forefather, MacIan with the broken sword, bleeding without hope at Culloden. It is Charles refusing to answer the questions of the rebel court. It is Mary of the magic face confronting the gloomy and grasping peers and the boorish moralities of Knox. It is Richard, the last Plantagenet, giving his crown to Bolingbroke as to a common brigand. It is Arthur overwhelmed in Lyonesse by heathen armies and dying in the mist, doubtful if ever he shall return." "But now," said Evan in a low voice. "But now," said the old man, "he has returned." "Is the war still raging?" asked MacIan. "It rages like the pit itself beyond the sea whither I am taking you," answered the other. "But in England the king enjoys his own again. The people are once more taught and ruled as is best. They are happy knights, happy squires, happy servants, happy serfs if you will, but free at last of that load of vexation and lonely vanity which was called being a citizen." "Is England indeed so secure?" asked Evan. "Look out and see," said the guide. "I fancy you have seen this place before." They were driving through the air towards one region of the sky where the hollow of night seemed darkest, and which was quite without stars. But against this black background there sprang up, picked out in glittering silver, a dome and a cross. It seemed that it was really newly covered with silver, which in the strong moonlight was like white flame. But, however, covered or painted, Evan had no difficulty in knowing the place again. He saw the great thoroughfare that sloped upward to the base of its huge pedestal of steps, and he wondered whether the little shop was still by the side of it, and whether its window had been mended. As the flying ship swept round the dome he observed other alterations. The dome had been redecorated so as to give it a more solemn and somewhat more ecclesiastical note. The ball was draped or destroyed, and round the gallery under the cross ran what looked like a ring of silver statues, like the little leaden images that stood round the hat of Louis XI. Round the second gallery, at the base of the dome, ran a second rank of such images, and Evan thought there was another round the steps below. When they came closer he saw that they were figures in complete armour of steel or silver, each with a naked sword, point upward. And then he saw one of the swords move. These were not statues, but an armed order of chivalry thrown in 3 circles round the cross. MacIan drew in his breath, as children do at anything they think utterly beautiful; for he could imagine nothing that so echoed his own visions of pontifical or chivalric art as this white dome sitting like a vast silver tiara over London, ringed with a triple crown of swords. As they went sailing down Ludgate Hill, Evan saw that the state of the streets fully answered his companion's claim about the reintroduction of order. All the old black-coated bustle with its cockney vivacity and vulgarity had disappeared. Groups of labourers, quietly but picturesquely clad, were passing up and down in sufficiently large numbers; but it required but a few mounted men to keep the streets in order. The mounted men were not common policemen, but knights with spurs and plume, whose smooth and splendid armour glittered like diamond rather than steel. Only in one place, at the corner of Bovary Street, did there appear to be a moment's confusion, and that was due to hurry rather than resistance. But one old grumbling man did not get out of the way quick enough, and the man on horseback struck him, not severely, across the shoulders with the flat of his sword. "The soldier had no business to do that," said MacIan sharply. "The old man was moving as quickly as he could." "We attach great importance to discipline in the streets," said the man in white, with a slight smile. "Discipline is not so important as justice," said MacIan. The other did not answer. Then, after a swift silence that took them out across St. James's Park, he said, "The people must be taught to obey. They must learn their own ignorance. And I am not sure," he continued, turning his back on Evan, and looking out of the prow of the ship into the darkness, "I am not sure that I agree with your little maxim about justice. Discipline for the whole society is surely more important than justice to an individual." Evan, who was also leaning over the edge, swung round with startling suddenness and stared at the other's back. "Discipline for society," he repeated, very staccato. "More important, justice to individual?" Then after a long silence he called out, "Who and what are you?" "I am an angel," said the white-robed figure without turning round. "You are not a Catholic," said MacIan. The other seemed to take no notice, but reverted to the main topic. "In our armies up in heaven we learn to put a wholesome fear into subordinates." MacIan sat craning his neck forward with an extraordinary and unaccountable eagerness. "Go on," he cried, twisting and untwisting his long bony fingers. "Go on." "Besides," continued he in the prow, "you must allow for a certain high spirit and haughtiness in the superior type." "Go on," said Evan with burning eyes. "Just as the sight of sin offends God," said the unknown, "so does the sight of ugliness offend Apollo. The beautiful and princely must, of necessity, be impatient with the squalid and—" "Why, you great fool!" cried MacIan, rising to the top of his tremendous stature. "Did you think I would have doubted only for that rap with a sword? I know that noble orders have bad knights, that good knights have bad tempers, that the Church has rough priests and coarse cardinals. I have known it ever since I was born. You fool, you had only to say, 'Yes, it is rather a shame,' and I would have forgotten the affair. But I saw in your mouth the twitch of your infernal sophistry. I knew that something was wrong with you and your cathedrals. Something is wrong. Everything is wrong. You are not an angel. That is not a church. It is not the rightful king who has come home." "That is unfortunate," said the other, in a quiet but hard voice, "because you are going to see his majesty." "No," said MacIan, "I am going to jump over the side." "Do you desire death?" "No," said Evan, quite composedly, "I desire a miracle." "From whom do you ask it? To whom do you appeal?" said his companion, sternly. "You have betrayed the king, renounced his cross on the cathedral, and insulted an archangel." "I appeal to God," said Evan, and sprang up and stood upon the edge of the swaying ship. The being in the prow turned slowly round. He looked at Evan with eyes which were like two suns, and put his hand to his mouth just too late to hide an awful smile. "And how do you know," he said, "how do you know that I am not God?" MacIan screamed. "Ah!" he cried, "now I know who you really are. You are not God, you are not one of God's angels, but you were once." The being's hand dropped from his mouth, and Evan dropped out of the car. End of chapter 15. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 16. The Dream of Turnbull. Turnbull was walking rather rampantly up and down the garden on a gusty evening, chewing his cigar, and in that mood when every man suppresses an instinct to spit. He was not, as a rule, a man much acquainted with moods, and the storms and sunbursts of McKeon's soul passed before him as an impressive but unmeaning panorama, like the anarchy of Highland scenery. Turnbull was one of those men in whom a continuous appetite and industry of the intellect leave the emotions very simple and steady. His heart was in the right place, but he was quite content to leave it there. It was his head that was his hobby. His mornings and evenings were marked not by impulses, or thirsty desires, not by hope, or by heartbreak. They were filled with the fallacies he had detected, the problems he had made plain, the adverse theories he had wrestled with and thrown, the grand generalizations he had justified. But even the cheerful inner life of a logician may be upset by a lunatic asylum, to say nothing of whiffs of memory from a lady in Jersey, and the little red-bearded man on this windy evening was in a dangerous frame of mind. Plain and positive as he was, the influence of earth and sky may have been greater on him than he imagined, and the weather that walked the world at that moment was as red and angry as Turnbull. Long strips and swirls of tattered and tawny cloud were dragged downward to the west exactly as torn red raiment would be dragged. And so strong and pitiless was the wind that it whipped away fragments of red flowering bushes or of copper beech, and drove them also across the garden, a drift of red leaves, like the leaves of autumn, as in parody of the red and driven rags of cloud. There was a sense in earth and heaven as of everything breaking up, and all the revolutionist in Turnbull rejoiced that it was breaking up. The trees were breaking up under the wind, even in the tall strength of their bloom. The clouds were breaking up and losing even their large heraldic shapes. Shards and shreds of copper cloud split off continually and floated by themselves, and for some reason the truculent eye of Turnbull was attracted to one of these careering cloudlets, which seemed to him to career in an exaggerated manner. Also it kept its shape, which is unusual with clouds shaken off. Also its shape was of an odd sort. Turnbull continued to stare at it, and in a little time occurred that crucial instant when a thing, however incredible, is accepted as a fact. The copper cloud was tumbling down towards the earth like some gigantic leaf from the copper beeches. And as it came nearer it was evident, first, that it was not a cloud, and, second, that it was not itself of the color of copper. Only, being burnished like a mirror, it had reflected the red-brown colors of the burning clouds. As the thing whirled like a wind-swept leaf down towards the wall of the garden, it was clear that it was some sort of airship made of metal, and slapping the air with big broad fins of steel. When it came about 100 feet above the garden, a shaggy, lean figure leapt up in it, almost black against the bronze and scarlet of the west, and, flinging out a kind of hook or anchor, cut on to the golden apple-tree just under the wall; and from that fixed holding-ground the ship swung in the red tempest like a captive balloon. While our friend stood frozen for an instant by his astonishment, the queer figure in the airy car tipped the vehicle almost upside down by leaping over the side of it, seemed to slide or drop down the rope like a monkey, and alighted, with impossible precision and placidity, seated on the edge of the wall, over which he kicked and dangled his legs as he grinned at Turnbull. The wind roared in the trees yet more ruinous and desolate, The red tails of the sunset were dragged downward like red dragons sucked down to death, and still on the top of the asylum wall sat the sinister figure with the grimace, swinging his feet in tune with the tempest; while above him, at the end of its tossing or tightened cord, the enormous iron airship floated as light and as little noticed as a baby's balloon upon its string. Turnbull's first movement after 60 motionless seconds was to turn round and look at the large, luxuriant parallelogram of the garden and the long, low rectangular building beyond. There was not a soul or a stir of life within sight, and he had a quite meaningless sensation, as if there never had really been any one else there except he since the foundation of the world. Stiffening in himself the masculine but mirthless courage of the atheist, he drew a little nearer to the wall and, catching the man at a slightly different angle of the evening light, could see his face and figure quite plain. Two facts about him stood out in the picked colors of some piratical schoolboy's story. The first was that his lean brown body was bare to the belt of his loose white trousers. The other was that through hygiene, affectation, or whatever other cause, he had a scarlet handkerchief tied tightly but somewhat aslant across his brow. After these two facts had become emphatic, others appeared sufficiently important. One was that under the scarlet rag the hair was plentiful, but white as with the last snows of mortality. Another was that under the mop of white and senile hair the face was strong, handsome, and smiling, with a well-cut profile and a long cloven chin. The length of this lower part of the face and the strange cleft in it, which gave the man, in quite another sense from the common one, a double chin, faintly spoilt the claim of the face to absolute regularity, but it greatly assisted it in wearing the expression of half-smiling and half-sneering arrogance with which it was staring at all the stones, all the flowers, but especially at the solitary man. "What do you want?" shouted Turnbull. "I want you, Jimmy," said the eccentric man on the wall, and with the very word he had let himself down with a leap onto the center of the lawn, where he bounded once literally like an India rubber ball, and then stood grinning with his legs astride. The only three facts that Turnbull could now add to his inventory were that the man had an ugly-looking knife swinging at his trousers belt, that his brown feet were as bare as his bronze trunk and arms, and that his eyes had a singular bleak brilliancy which was of no particular color. "Excuse my not being in evening dress," said the newcomer with an urbane smile. "We scientific men, you know, I have to work my own engines, electrical engineer, very hot work." "Look here," said Turnbull, sturdily clenching his fists in his trousers pockets, "I am bound to expect lunatics inside these four walls, but I do bar their coming from outside, bang out of the sunset clouds." "And yet you came from the outside too, Jim," said the stranger in a voice almost affectionate. "What do you want?" asked Turnbull, with an explosion of temper as sudden as a pistol shot. "I have already told you," said the man, lowering his voice and speaking with evident sincerity. "I want you." "What do you want with me?" "I want exactly what you want," said the newcomer with a new gravity. "I want the revolution." Turnbull looked at the fire-swept sky and the wind-stricken woodlands, and kept on repeating the word voicelessly to himself, the word that did indeed so thoroughly express his mood of rage as it had been among those red clouds and rocking tree-tops. "Revolution," he said to himself. "The revolution. Yes, that is what I want right enough. Anything so long as it is a revolution." To some cause he could never explain, he found himself completing the sentence on the top of the wall, having automatically followed the stranger so far. But when the stranger silently indicated the rope that led to the machine, he found himself pausing and saying, "I can't leave Mckeon behind in this den." "We are going to destroy the Pope and all the kings," said the newcomer. "Would it be wiser to take him with us?" Somehow the muttering Turnbull found himself in the flying ship also, and it swung up into the sunset. "All the great rebels have been very little rebels," said the man with the red scarf. "They have been like fourth form boys who sometimes venture to hit a fifth form boy. That was all the worth of their French Revolution and regicide. The boys never really dared to defy the schoolmaster." "Whom do you mean by the schoolmaster?" asked Turnbull. "You know whom I mean," answered the strange man, as he lay back on cushions and looked up into the angry sky. They seemed rising into stronger and stronger sunlight, as if it were sunrise rather than sunset. But when they looked down at the earth they saw it growing darker and darker. The Lunatic Asylum in its large rectangular grounds spread below them in a foreshortened and infantile plan, and looked for the first time the grotesque thing that it was. But the clear colors of the plan were growing darker every moment. The masses of rose or rhododendron deepened from crimson to violet. The maze of gravel pathways faded from gold to brown. By the time they had risen a few hundred feet higher, nothing could be seen of that darkening landscape except the lines of lighted windows, each one of which, at least, was the light of one lost intelligence. But on them as they swept upward better and braver winds seemed to blow, and on them the ruby light of evening seemed struck, and splashed like red spurts from the grapes of Dionysus. Below them the fallen lights were literally the fallen stars of servitude, and above them all the red and raging clouds were like the leaping flags of liberty. The man with the cloven chin seemed to have a singular power of understanding thoughts, for, as Turnbull felt the whole universe tilt and turn over his head, the stranger said exactly the right thing. "Doesn't it seem as if everything were being upset?" said he. "And if once everything is upset, he will be upset on top of it." Then, as Turnbull made no answer, his host continued: "That is the really fine thing about space. It is topsy-turvy. You have only to climb far enough towards the morning star to feel that you are coming down to it. You have only to dive deep enough into the abyss to feel that you are rising. That is the only glory of this universe. It is a giddy universe." Then, as Turnbull was still silent, he added: "The heavens are full of revolution. Of the real sort of revolution. All the high things are sinking low, and all the big things looking small. All the people who think they are aspiring find that they are falling head foremost, and all the people who think they are condescending find that they are climbing up a precipice. That is the intoxication of space. That is the only joy of eternity, doubt. There is only one pleasure the angels can possibly have in flying, and that is, that they do not know whether they are on their head or their heels." Then, finding his companion still mute, he fell himself into a smiling and motionless meditation, at the end of which he said suddenly: "So MacIan converted you?" Turnbull sprang up as if spurning the steel car from under his feet. "Converted me!" he cried. "What the devil do you mean? I have known him for a month, and I have not retracted a single—" "This Catholicism is a curious thing," said the man of the cloven chin in uninterrupted reflectiveness, leaning his elegant elbows over the edge of the vessel. "It soaks and weakens men without their knowing it, just as I fear it has soaked and weakened you." Turnbull stood in an attitude which might well have meant pitching the other man out of the flying ship. "I am an atheist," he said in a stifled voice. "I have always been an atheist. I am still an atheist." Then, addressing the other's indolent and indifferent back, he cried, "In God's name, what do you mean?" And the other answered without turning around, "I mean nothing in God's name." Turnbull spat over the edge of the car and fell back furiously into his seat. The other continued still unruffled, and staring over the edge idly as an angler stares down at a stream. "The truth is that we never thought that you could have been caught," he said. "We counted on you as the one red-hot revolutionary left in the world. But, of course, these men like Mckeon are awfully clever, especially when they pretend to be stupid." Turnbull leapt up again in a living fury and cried, "What have I got to do with Mckeon? I believe all I ever believed, and disbelieve all I ever disbelieved. What does all this mean, and what do you want with me here?" Then for the first time the other lifted himself from the edge of the car and faced him. "I have brought you here," he answered, To take part in the last war of the world." "The last war!" repeated Turnbull, even in his dazed state a little touchy about such a dogma. "How do you know it will be the last?" The man laid himself back in his reposeful attitude and said, "It is the last war, because if it does not cure the world forever, it will destroy it." "What do you mean?" "I only mean what you mean," answered the unknown in a temperate voice. "What was it that you always meant on those 1,000,001 nights when you walked outside your Ludgate Hill shop and shook your hand in the air?" "Still I do not see," said Turnbull stubbornly. "You will soon," said the other, and abruptly bent downward one iron handle of his huge machine. The engine stopped, stooped, and dived almost as deliberately as a man bathing. In their downward rush they swept within 50 yards of a big bulk of stone that Turnbull knew only too well. The last red anger of the sunset was ended. The dome of heaven was dark. The lanes of flaring light in the streets below hardly lit up the base of the building. But he saw that it was St. Paul's Cathedral, and he saw that on the top of it the ball was still standing erect, but the cross was stricken and had fallen sideways. Then only he cared to look down into the streets, and saw that they were inflamed with uproar and tossing passions. "We arrive at a happy moment," said the man steering the ship. "The insurgents are bombarding the city, and the cannon ball has just hit the cross. Many of the insurgents are simple people, and they naturally regard it as a happy omen." "Quite so," said Turnbull in a rather colourless voice. "Yes," replied the other, "I thought you would be glad to see your prayer answered. Of course I apologize for the word prayer." "Don't mention it," said Turnbull. The flying ship had come down upon a sort of curve, and was now rising again. The higher and higher it rose, the broader and broader became the scenes of flame and desolation underneath. Ludgate Hill indeed had been an uncaptured and comparatively quiet height, altered only by the startling coincidence of the cross fallen awry. All the other thoroughfares on all sides of that hill were full of the pulsation and the pain of battle, full of shaking torches and shouting faces. When at length they had risen high enough to have a bird's eye view of the whole campaign, Turnbull was already intoxicated. He had smelt gunpowder, which was the incense of his own revolutionary religion. "Have the people really risen?" he asked breathlessly. "What are they fighting about?" "The programme is rather elaborate," said his entertainer with some indifference. "I think Dr. Hertz drew it up." Turnbull wrinkled his forehead. "Are all the poor people with the revolution?" he asked. The other shrugged his shoulders. "All the instructed and class-conscious part of them without exception," he replied. "There were certainly a few districts. In fact, we are passing over them just now." Turnbull looked down and saw that the polished car was literally lit up from underneath by the far-flung fires from below. Underneath, whole squares and solid districts were in flames, like prairies or forests on fire. "Dr. Hertz has convinced everybody," said Turnbull's cicerone in a smooth voice, "that nothing can really be done with the real slums. His celebrated maxim has been quite adopted. I mean the 3 celebrated sentences: no man should be unemployed. Employ the employables, destroy the unemployables." There was a silence, and then Turnbull said in a rather strained voice, "And do I understand that this good work is going on under here?" "Going on splendidly," replied his companion in the heartiest voice. "You see, these people were much too tired and weak even to join the social war. They were a definite hindrance to it." "And so you are simply burning them out?" "It does seem absurdly simple," said the man with a beaming smile, "when one thinks of all the worry and talk about helping a hopeless slave population, when the future obviously was only crying to be rid of them. There are happy babes unborn ready to burst the doors when these drivellers are swept away." "Will you permit me to say," said Turnbull after reflection, "that I don't like all this?" "And will you permit me to say," said the other with a snap, "that I don't like Mr. Evan MacIan?" Somewhat to the speaker's surprise, this did not inflame the sensitive skeptic. He had the air of thinking thoroughly, and then he said, "No, I don't think it's my friend MacIan that taught me that. I think I should always have said that I don't like this. These people have rights." "Rights!" repeated the unknown in a tone quite indescribable. Then he added with a more open sneer, "Perhaps they also have souls." "They have lives," said Turnbull, sternly. "That is quite enough for me. I understood you to say that you thought life sacred." "Yes, indeed," cried his mentor with a sort of idealistic animation. "Yes, indeed, life is sacred, but lives are not sacred. We are improving life by removing lives. Can you, as a free thinker, find any fault in that?" "Yes," said Turnbull with brevity. "Yet you applaud tyrannicide," said the stranger with rationalistic gaiety. "How inconsistent! It really comes to this. You approve of taking away life from those to whom it is a triumph and a pleasure. But you will not take away life from those to whom it is a burden and a toil." Turnbull rose to his feet in the car with considerable deliberation, but his face seemed oddly pale. The other went on with enthusiasm. "Life, yes, life is indeed sacred," he cried, "but new lives for old, good lives for bad. On that very place where now there sprawls one drunken wastrel of a pavement artist, more or less wishing he were dead, on that very spot there shall in the future be living pictures. There shall be golden girls and boys leaping in the sun." Turnbull, still standing up, opened his lips. "Will you put me down, please?" he said quite calmly, like on stopping an omnibus. "Put you down? What do you mean?" cried his leader. "I am taking you to the front of the Revolutionary War, where you will be one of the first of the revolutionary leaders." "Thank you," replied Turnbull with the same painful constraint. "I have heard about your Revolutionary War, and I think on the whole that I would rather be anywhere else." "Do you want to be taken to a monastery?" snarled the other, "with McKeon and his winking Madonnas?" "I want to be taken to a madhouse," said Turnbull distinctly, giving the direction with a sort of precision. "I want to go back to exactly the same lunatic asylum from which I came." "Why?" asked the unknown. "Because I want a little sane and wholesome society," answered Turnbull. There was a long and peculiar silence, and then the man driving the flying machine said quite coolly, "I won't take you back." And then Turnbull said equally coolly, "Then I'll jump out of the car." The unknown rose to his full height, and the expression in his eyes seemed to be made of ironies behind ironies, as two mirrors infinitely reflect each other. At last he said, very gravely, "Do you think I am the devil?" "Yes," said Turnbull violently, "for I think the devil is a dream, and so are you. I don't believe in you or your flying ship or your last fight of the world. It is all a nightmare. I say as a fact of dogma and faith that it is all a nightmare. And I will be a martyr for my faith as much as St. Catherine, for I will jump out of this ship and risk waking up safe in bed." After swaying twice with the swaying vessel, he dived over the side as one dives into the sea. For some incredible moments stars and space and planets seemed to shoot up past him as the sparks fly upward, and yet in that sickening descent he was full of some unnatural happiness. He could connect it with no idea except one that half escaped him, what Evan had said of the difference between Christ and Satan, that it was by Christ's own choice that he descended into hell. When he again realized anything, he was lying on his elbow on the lawn of the lunatic asylum, and the last red of the sunset had not yet disappeared. End of chapter 16. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 17. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 17. The Idiot. Evan McKeon was standing a few yards off looking at him in absolute silence. He had not the moral courage to ask McKeon if there had been anything astounding in the manner of his coming there, nor did MacIan seem to have any question to ask, or perhaps any need to ask it. The two men came slowly towards each other, and found the same expression on each other's faces. Then for the first time in all their acquaintance, they shook hands. Almost as if this were a kind of unconscious signal, it brought Dr. Quayle bounding out of a door and running across the lawn. "Oh, there you are!" he exclaimed with a relieved giggle. "Will you come inside, please? I want to speak to you both." They followed him into his shiny wooden office where their damning record was kept. Dr. Quayle sat down on a swivel chair and swung round to face them. His carved smile had suddenly disappeared. "I will be plain with you, gentlemen," he said abruptly. "You know quite well we do our best for everybody here. Your cases have been under special consideration, and the Master himself has decided that you ought to be treated specially, and under somewhat simpler conditions." "You mean treated worse, I suppose," said Turnbull gruffly. The doctor did not reply, and MacIan said, "I expected this." His eyes had begun to glow. The doctor answered, looking at his desk and playing with the key, "Well, in certain cases that give anxiety it is often better—" "Give anxiety!" said Turnbull fiercely. "Confound your impudence! What do you mean? You imprison two perfectly sane men in a madhouse because you have made up a long word. They take it in good temper, walk and talk in your garden like monks who have found a vocation, are civil even to you, you damned druggist's hack. Behave not only more sanely than any of your patients, but more sanely than half the sane men outside, and you have the soul-stifling cheek to say that they give anxiety." "The head of the asylum has settled it all," said Dr. Quayle, still looking down. MacIan took one of his immense strides forward and stood over the doctor with flaming eyes. "If the head has settled it, let the head announce it," he said. "I won't take it from you. I believe you to be a low, gibbering degenerate. Let us see the head of the asylum." "See the head of the asylum!" repeated Dr. Quayle. "Certainly not." The tall Highlander, bending over him, put one hand on his shoulder with fatherly interest. "You don't seem to appreciate the peculiar advantages of my position as a lunatic," he said. "I could kill you with my left hand before such a rat as you could so much as squeak, and I wouldn't be hanged for it." "I certainly agree with Mr. McKeon," said Turnbull with sobriety and perfect respectfulness, "that you had better let us see the head of the institution." Dr. Quayle got to his feet in a mixture of sudden hysteria and clumsy presence of mind. "Oh, certainly," he said with a weak laugh. "You can see the head of the asylum if you particularly want to." He almost ran out of the room, and the two followed swiftly on his flying coat-tails. He knocked at an ordinary varnished door in the corridor. When a voice said, "Come in," MacIan's breath went hissing back through his teeth into his chest. Turnbull was more impetuous and opened the door. It was a neat and well-appointed room entirely lined with a medical library. At the other end of it was a ponderous and polished desk with an incandescent lamp on it, the light of which was just sufficient to show a slender, well-bred figure in an ordinary medical black frock-coat, whose head, quite silvered with age, was bent over neat piles of notes. This gentleman looked up for an instant as they entered, and the lamplight fell on his glittering spectacles and long, clean-shaven face—a face which would have been simply like an aristocrat's, but that a certain lion poise of the head and long cleft in the chin made it look more like a very handsome actor's. It was only for a flash that his face was thus lifted. Then he bent his silver head over his notes once more, and said, without looking up again, "I told you, Dr. Quayle, that these men were to go to cells B and C." Turnbull and MacIan looked at each other, and said more than they could ever say with tongues or swords. Among other things, they said that to that particular head of the institution it was a waste of time to appeal, and they followed Dr. Quayle out of the room. The instant they stepped out into the corridor, 4 sturdy figures stepped from 4 sides, pinioned them, and ran them along the galleries. They might very likely have thrown their captors right and left had they been inclined to resist, but for some nameless reason they were more inclined to laugh. A mixture of mad irony with childish curiosity made them feel quite inclined to see what next twist would be taken by their imbecile luck. They were dragged down countless cold avenues lined with glazed tiles, different only in being of different lengths and set at different angles. They were so many and so monotonous that to escape back by them would have been far harder than fleeing from the Hampton Court maze. Only the fact that windows grew fewer, coming at longer intervals, and the fact that when the windows did come they seemed shadowed and let in less light, showed that they were winding into the core or belly of some enormous building. After a little time the glazed corridors began to be lit by electricity. At last, when they had walked nearly a mile in those white and polished tunnels, they came with quite a shock to the futile finality of a cul-de-sac. All that white and weary journey ended suddenly in an oblong space and a blank white wall. But in the white wall there were 2 iron doors painted white, on which were written, respectively, in neat black capitals, B and C. "You go in here, sir," said the leader of the officials, quite respectfully, "and you in here." But before the doors had clanged upon their dazed victims, MacIan had been able to say to Turnbull with a strange drawl of significance, "I wonder who A is." Turnbull made an automatic struggle before he allowed himself to be thrown into the cell. Hence it happened that he was the last to enter, and was still full of the exhilaration of the adventures for at least 5 minutes after the echo of the clanging door had died away. Then, when silence had sunk deep and nothing happened for 2½ hours, it suddenly occurred to him that this was the end of his life. He was hidden and sealed up in this little crack of stone until the flesh should fall off his bones. He was dead, and the world had won. His cell was of an oblong shape, but very long in comparison with its width. It was just wide enough to permit the arms to be fully extended with the dumb-bells, which were hung up on the left wall, very dusty. It was, however, long enough for a man to walk 1/35th part of a mile if he traversed it entirely. On the same principle a row of fixed holes, quite close together, let into those cells by pipes what was alleged to be the freshest air. For these great scientific organizers insisted that a man should be healthy even if he was miserable. They provided a walk long enough to give him exercise and holes large enough to give him oxygen. There their interest in human nature suddenly ceased. It seemed never to have occurred to them that the benefit of exercise belongs partly to the benefit of liberty. They had not entertained the suggestion that the open air is only one of the advantages of the open sky. They administered air in secret, but in sufficient doses, as if it were a medicine. They suggested walking, as if no man had ever felt inclined to walk. Above all, the asylum authorities insisted on their own extraordinary cleanliness. Every morning, while Turnbull was still half asleep on his iron bedstead, which was lifted halfway up the wall and clamped to it with iron, 4 sluices or metal mouths opened above him at the 4 corners of the chamber and washed it white of any defilement. Turnbull's solitary soul surged up against this sickening daily solemnity. "I am buried alive!" he cried bitterly. "They have hidden me under mountains. I shall be here till I rot. Why the blazes should it matter to them whether I am dirty or clean?" Every morning and evening an iron hatchway opened in his oblong cell, and a brown hairy hand or two thrust in a plate of perfectly cooked lentils and a big bowl of cocoa. He was not underfed any more than he was under-exercised or asphyxiated. He had ample walking space, ample air, ample and even filling food. The only objection was that he had nothing to walk towards, nothing to feast about, and no reason whatever for drawing the breath of life. Even the shape of his cell especially irritated him. It was a long, narrow parallelogram, which had a flat wall at one end and ought to have had a flat wall at the other; but that end was broken by a wedge or angle of space, like the prow of a ship. After 3 days of silence and cocoa, this angle at the end began to infuriate Turnbull. It maddened him to think that 2 lines came together and pointed at nothing. After the 5th day he was reckless and poked his head into the corner. After 25 days he almost broke his head against it. Then he became quite cool and stupid again and began to examine it like a sort of Robinson Crusoe. Almost unconsciously it was his instinct to examine outlets, and he found himself paying particular attention to the row of holes which let in the air into his last house of life. He soon discovered that these air holes were all the ends and mouths of long leaden tubes which doubtless carried air from some remote watering place near Margate. One evening while he was engaged in the 5th investigation he noticed something like twilight in one of these dumb mouths, as compared with the darkness of the others. Thrusting his finger in as far as it would go, he found a hole and flapping edge in the tube. This he rent open, and instantly saw a light behind. It was at least certain that he had struck some other cell. It is a characteristic of all things now called efficient, which means mechanical and calculated, that if they go wrong at all, they go entirely wrong. There is no power of retrieving a defeat, as in simpler and more living organisms. A strong gun can conquer a strong elephant, but a wounded elephant can easily conquer a broken gun. Thus the Prussian monarchy in the 18th century, or now, can make a strong army merely by making the men afraid. But it does it with the permanent possibility that the men may some day be more afraid of their enemies than of their officers. Thus the drainage in our cities, so long as it is quite solid, means a general safety, but if there is one leak it means concentrated poison, an explosion of deathly germs like dynamite, a spirit of stink. Thus, indeed, all that excellent machinery which is the swiftest thing on earth in saving human labor is also the slowest thing on earth in resisting human interference. It may be easier to get chocolate for nothing out of a shopkeeper than out of an automatic machine, but if you did manage to steal the chocolate, the automatic machine would be much less likely to run after you. Turnbull was not long in discovering this truth in connection with the cold and colossal machinery of this great asylum. He had been shaken by many spiritual states since the instant when he was pitched head foremost into that private cell which was to be his private room till death. He had felt a high fit of pride and poetry, which had ebbed away and left him deadly cold. He had known a period of mere scientific curiosity, in the course of which he examined all the tiles of his cell, with the gratifying conclusion that they were all the same shape and size, but was greatly puzzled about the angle in the wall at the end, and also about an iron peg or spike that stood out from the wall, the object of which he does not know to this day. When he had a period of mere madness not to be written of by decent men, but only by those few dirty novelists hallooed on by the infernal huntsman to hunt down and humiliate human nature. This also passed, but left behind it a feverish distaste for many of the mere objects around him. Long after he had returned to sanity and such hopeless cheerfulness as a man might have on a desert island, he disliked the regular squares of the pattern of wall and floor and the triangle that terminated his corridor. Above all, he had a hatred, deep as the hell he did not believe in, for the objectless iron peg in the wall. But in all his moods, sane or insane, intolerant or stoical, he never really doubted this, that the machine held him as light and as hopelessly as he had from his birth been held by the hopeless cosmos of his own creed. He knew well the ruthless and inexhaustible resources of our scientific civilization. He no more expected rescue from a medical certificate than rescue from the solar system. In many of his Robinson Crusoe moods he thought kindly of Mckeon as of some quarrelsome schoolfellow who had long been dead. He thought of leaving in the cell when he died a rigid record of his opinions, and when he began to write them down on scraps of envelope in his pocket, he was startled to discover how much they had changed. Then he remembered the Beauchamp Tower, and tried to write his blazing skepticism on the wall, and discovered that it was all shiny tiles on which nothing could be either drawn or carved. Then for an instant there hung and broke above him like a high wave the whole horror of scientific imprisonment, which manages to deny a man not only liberty, but every accidental comfort of bondage. In the old filthy dungeons men could carve their prayers or protests in the rock. Here the white and slippery walls escaped even from bearing witness. The old prisoners could make a pet of a mouse or a beetle straight out of a hole. Here the unpierceable walls were washed every morning by an automatic sluice. There was no natural corruption and no merciful decay by which a living thing could enter in. Then James Turnbull looked up and saw the high invincible hatefulness of the society in which he lived, and saw the hatefulness of something else also, which he told himself again and again was not the cosmos in which he believed. But all the time he had never once doubted that the 5 sides of his cell were for him the wall of the world henceforward, and it gave him a shock of surprise even to discover the faint light through the aperture in the ventilation tube. But he had forgotten how close efficiency has to pack everything together, and how easily, therefore, a pipe here or there may leak. Turnbull thrust his first finger down the aperture, and at last managed to make a slight further fissure in the piping. The light that came up from beyond was very faint, and apparently indirect. It seemed to fall from some hole or window higher up. As he was screwing his eye to peer at this grey and greasy twilight, he was astonished to see another human finger, very long and lean, come down from above towards the broken pipe and hook it up to something higher. The lighted aperture was abruptly blackened and blocked, presumably by a face and mouth, for something human spoke down the tube, though the words were not clear. "Who is that?" asked Turnbull, trembling with excitement, yet wary and quite resolved not to spoil any chance. After a few indistinct sounds the voice came down with a strong Argyllshire accent. "I say, Turnbull, we couldn't fight through this tube, could we?" Sentiments beyond speech surged up in Turnbull and silenced him for a space just long enough to be painful. Then he said with his old gaiety, "I vote we talk a little first. I don't want to murder the first man I have met for 10,000,000 years." "I know what you mean," answered the other. "It has been awful. For a mortal month I have been alone with God." Turnbull started, and it was on the tip of his tongue to answer, "Alone with God! Then you do not know what loneliness is." But he answered after all, in his old defiant style, "Alone with God, were you? And I suppose you found His Majesty's society rather monotonous?" "Oh, no," said MacIan, and his voice shuddered. "It was a great deal too exciting." After a very long silence the voice of MacIan said, "What do you really hate most in your place?" "You'd think I was really mad if I told you," answered Turnbull, bitterly. "Then I expect it's the same as mine," said the other voice. "I am sure it's not the same as anybody's," said Turnbull, "for it has no rhyme or reason. Perhaps my brain really has gone, but I detest that iron spike in the left wall more than the damned desolation or the damned cocoa. Have you got one in your cell?" "Not now," replied MacIan with serenity. "I've pulled it out." His fellow prisoner could only repeat the words. "I pulled it out the other day when I was off my head," continued the tranquil Highland voice. "It looked so unnecessary." "You must be ghastly strong," said Turnbull. "One is when one is mad," was the careless reply, "and it had worn a little loose in the socket. Even now I've got it out I can't discover what it was for. But I've found out something a long sight funnier." "What do you mean?" asked Turnbull. "I have found out where A is," said the other. 3 weeks afterwards MacIan had managed to open up communications which made his meaning plain. By that time the 2 captives had fully discovered and demonstrated that weakness in the very nature of modern machinery to which we have already referred. The very fact that they were isolated from all companions meant that they were free from all spies. And as there are no jailers to be bribed, so there were none to be baffled. Machinery brought them their cocoa and cleaned their cells. That machinery was as helpless as it was pitiless. A little patient violence, conducted day after day amid constant mutual suggestion, opened an irregular hole in the wall, large enough to let in a small man, in the exact place where there had been before the tiny ventilation holes. Turnbull tumbled somehow into MacIan's apartment, and his first glance found out that the iron spike was indeed plucked from its socket, and left, moreover, another ragged hole into some hollow place behind. But for this MacIan's cell was the duplicate of Turnbull's, a long oblong ending in a wedge and lined with cold and lustrous tiles. The small hole from which the peg had been displaced was in that short oblique wall at the end nearest to Turnbull's. That individual looked at it with a puzzled face. "What is in there?" he asked. MacIan answered briefly, "Another cell." "But where can the door of it be?" asked his companion, even more puzzled. "The doors of our cells are at the other end." "It has no door," said Evan. In the pause of perplexity that followed, an eerie and sinister feeling crept over Turnbull's stubborn soul in spite of himself. The notion of the doorless room chilled him with that sense of half-witted curiosity which one has when something horrible is half understood. "James Turnbull," said MacIan in a low and shaken voice, "these people hate us more than Nero hated Christians, and fear us more than any man feared Nero. They have filled England with frenzy and galloping in order to capture us and wipe us out, in order to kill us. And they have killed us, for you and I have only made a hole in our coffins. But though this hatred that they felt for us is bigger than they felt for Bonaparte, and more plain and practical than they would feel for Jack the Ripper, yet it is not we whom the people of this place hate most." A cold and quivering impatience continued to crawl up Turnbull's spine. He had never felt so near to superstition and supernaturalism, and it was not a pretty sort of superstition either. "There is another man more fearful and hateful," went on MacIan, in his low monotone voice, "and they have buried him even deeper. God knows how they did it, for he was let in by neither door nor window, nor lowered through any opening above. I expect these iron handles that we both hate have been part of some damned machinery for walling him up. He is there. I have looked through the hole at him. But I cannot stand looking at him long, because his face is turned away from me and he does not move." All Turnbull's unnatural and uncompleted feelings found their outlet in rushing to the aperture and looking into the unknown room. It was a third oblong cell exactly like the other two, except that it was doorless, and except that on one of the walls was painted a large black A, like the B and C outside their own doors. The letter in this case was not painted outside, because this prison had no outside. On the same kind of tiled floor, of which the monotonous squares had maddened Turnbull's eye and brain, was sitting a figure which was startlingly short even for a child, only that the enormous head was ringed with hair of a frosty gray. The figure was draped, both insecurely and insufficiently, in what looked like the remains of a brown flannel dressing-gown. An emptied cup of cocoa stood on the floor beside it, and the creature had his big gray head cocked at a particular angle of inquiry or attention which amid all that gathering gloom and mystery struck one as comic, if not cocksure. After 6 still seconds Turnbull could stand it no longer, but called out to the dwarfish thing, in what words heaven knows. The thing got up with the promptitude of an animal, and turning round offered the spectacle of 2 owlish eyes and a huge grey and white beard not unlike the plumage of an owl. This extraordinary beard covered him literally to his feet, not that that was very far, and perhaps it was well that it did, for portions of his remaining clothing seemed to fall off whenever he moved. One talks trivially of a face like parchment, but this old man's face was so wrinkled, that it was like a parchment loaded with hieroglyphics. The lines of his face were so deep and complex that one could see 5 or 10 different faces besides the real one, as one can see them in an elaborate wallpaper. And yet while his face seemed like a scripture older than the gods, his eyes were quite bright, blue, and startled like those of a baby. They looked as if they had only an instant before been fitted into his head. Everything depended so obviously on whether this buried monster spoke that Turnbull did not know or care whether he himself had spoken. He said something or nothing, and then he waited for this dwarfish voice that had been hidden under the mountains of the world. At last it did speak, and spoke in English with a foreign accent that was neither Latin nor Teutonic. He suddenly stretched out a long and very dirty forefinger, and cried in a voice of clear recognition like a child's, "That's a hole!" He digested the discovery for some seconds, sucking his finger, and then he cried, with a crow of laughter, "And that's a head come through it!" The hilarious energy in this idiot attitude gave Turnbull another sick turn. He had grown to tolerate those dreary and mumbling madmen who trailed themselves about the beautiful asylum gardens. But there was something new and subversive of the universe in the combination of so much cheerful decision with a body without a brain. "Why did they put you in such a place?" he asked at last with embarrassment. "Good place, yes," said the old man, nodding a great many times and beaming like a flattered landlord. "Good shape, long and narrow, with a point, like this," and he made lovingly with his hands a map of the room in the air. "But that's not the best," he added confidentially. "Squares very good. I have a nice long holiday and can count them. But that's not the best." "What is the best?" asked Turnbull in great distress. "Spike is the best," said the old man, opening his blue eyes blazing. "It sticks out." The words Turnbull spoke broke out of him in pure pity. "Can't we do anything for you?" he said. "I am very happy," said the other alphabetically. "You are a good man. Can I help you?" "No, I don't think you can, sir," said Turnbull with rough pathos. "I am glad you are contented at least." The weird old person opened his broad blue eyes and fixed Turnbull with a stare extraordinarily severe. "You are quite sure," he said, "I cannot help you?" "Quite sure, thank you," said Turnbull with broken brevity. "Good day." Then he turned to MacIan, who was standing close behind him, and whose face, now familiar in all its moods, told him easily that Evan had heard the whole of the strange dialogue. "Curse those cruel beasts!" cried Turnbull. "They've turned him into an imbecile just by burying him alive. His brain's like a pin-point now." "You are sure he is a lunatic?" said Evan slowly. "Not a lunatic," said Turnbull. "An idiot. He just points to things and says that they stick out." "He had a notion that he could help us," said MacIan moodily, and began to pace towards the other end of his cell. "Yes, it was a bit pathetic," assented Turnbull. "Such a thing offering help. And besides Hallo, hallo, what's the matter?" "God Almighty guide us all!" said MacIan. He was standing heavy and still at the other end of the room, and staring quietly at the door which for 30 days had sealed them up from the sun. Turnbull, following the other's eye, stared at the door likewise, and then he also uttered an exclamation. The iron door was standing about 1.5 inches open. "He said," began Evan in a trembling voice, "he offered—" "Come along, you fool!" shouted Turnbull with a sudden and furious energy. "I see it all now, and it's the best stroke of luck in the world. You pulled out that iron handle that had screwed up his cell, and it somehow altered the machinery and opened all the doors." Seizing MacIan by the elbow, he bundled him bodily out into the open corridor and ran him on till they saw daylight through a half-darkened window. "All the same," said Evan, like one answering in an ordinary conversation. He did ask you whether he could help you." All this wilderness of windowless passages was so built into the heart of that fortress of fear that it seemed more than an hour before the fugitives had any good glimpse of the outer world. They did not even know what hour of the day it was; and when, turning a corner, they saw the bare tunnel of the corridor end abruptly in a shining square of garden, the grass burning in that strong evening sunshine which makes it burnished gold rather than green, the abrupt opening onto the earth seemed like a hole knocked in the wall of heaven. Only once or twice in life is it permitted to a man thus to see the very universe from outside, and feel existence itself as an adorable adventure not yet begun. As they found this shining escape out of that hellish labyrinth, they both had simultaneously the sensation of being babies unborn, of being asked by God if they would like to live upon the earth. They were looking in at one of the 7 gates of Eden. Turnbull was the first to leap into the garden, with an earth-spurning leap like that of one who could really spread his wings and fly. MacIan, who came an instant after, was less full of mere animal gusto, and fuller of a more fearful and quivering pleasure in the clear and innocent flower colours and the high and holy trees. With one bound they were in that cool and cleared landscape, and they found just outside the door the black-clad gentleman with the cloven chin smilingly regarding them. And his chin seemed to grow longer and longer as he smiled. Chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G.